In Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 20, Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." The following are footnotes from the Life Application Study Bible, the New International Version. If Jesus did not come to abolish the law, does that mean all the Old Testament laws still apply to us today? In the Old Testament, there were three categories of law: ceremonial, civil, and moral. The ceremonial law related specifically to Israel's worship. See Leviticus 1, verses 2 through 3, for an example. Its primary purpose was to point forward to Jesus Christ. These laws, therefore, were no longer necessary after Jesus' death and resurrection. While we are no longer bound by ceremonial law, the principles behind them, to worship and love the holy God, still apply. The Pharisees often accused Jesus of violating ceremonial law. The civil law applied to daily living in Israel. See Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 10 through 11, for an example. Because modern society and culture are so radically different from that time and setting, all of these guidelines cannot be followed specifically. But the principles behind the commands are timeless and should guide our conduct. Jesus demonstrated these principles by example. The moral law, such as the Ten Commandments, is the direct command of God, and it requires strict obedience. See Exodus chapter 20, verse 13 for an example. The moral law reveals God's nature and will for how we should relate to Him and to other people, and it still applies today. Jesus obeyed the moral law completely. God gave His moral and ceremonial laws to help people love Him with all their hearts and minds and to love others. Throughout Israel's history, however, these laws had often been misquoted and misapplied. By Jesus' time, religious leaders had turned the laws into a confusing mass of rules that only burdened people. When Jesus talked about a new way to understand God's law, He was actually trying to bring people back to its original purpose. Jesus did not speak against the law itself, but against the abuses and excesses to which it had been subjected. See John chapter 1, verse 17. Some of the people in the crowd were experts at telling others what to do, but they missed the central point of God's law. Jesus made it clear that obeying God's law means more than just explaining it. Studying God's law and telling others to obey it is much easier than putting it into practice. How are you doing at obeying God yourself? Righteousness means having a right love for God, leading to a right relationship with Him and others, producing right actions. The Pharisees were exacting and scrupulous in their attempts to follow their laws. They thought that was what they needed to do to please God. So how could Jesus reasonably call us to greater religiousness than theirs? The Pharisees' weakness was that they were content to obey the laws outwardly without allowing God to change their hearts or attitudes. They looked good and acted piously, but they were far from the kingdom of heaven. God is concerned about our hearts as well as our deeds, because our hearts show where our real allegiance lies. Jesus was saying that His listeners needed a different kind of righteousness altogether, out of love for God. Not just a more intense version of the Pharisees' obedience, which was mere legal compliance. Our righteousness must, number one, come from what God does in us, not what we can do by ourselves. 2, be God-centered, not self-centered. 3, be based on reverence for God, not approval from people. And 4, go beyond keeping the law to living by the principles behind the law. We should be just as concerned about our attitudes that people don't see as about our actions that are seen by all.